Going to get started. All right. So if you recall last week, we were in Joshua chapter 1, and we had really talked about the promises here in the beginning of the chapter that God had given Joshua here. He had promised that every place that the sole of your foot, this is verse 3, will tread upon, I have given to you. And then he describes the land that he's given him. In verse 5, he said, no man shall be able to stand before you all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will not leave you nor forsake you. And this is our memory verse that we've been reciting for the month as well. We left off talking about the topography of the land and kind of, as God describes it here, what that looks like for these people. The different types of land they were going to inherit, the coastal region, the hilly central area of the mainland of Canaan, Jordan River that divided the two sides, and then the Transjordan Plateau, and the different tribes that were going to inherit these lands. And we'll talk about that later when we get to the end of the book, and how that land was going to shape their future. Some of it was really good for agriculture, some of it was good for livestock, and so the tribes who settled in these regions were shaped by this land that they inherited. Talking specifically about the inhabitants of the land here, the people who God had promised Joshua would be able to stand up against them and defeat them, are described globally as the Canaanites. Why do we use this term to describe them? Do y'all remember? It goes back to Genesis. So in Genesis chapter... we'll see now, I've lost my place. Genesis 10 and verse 6 and then 15 through 20. This is the son of, these are the descendants of Canaan, who is the son of Ham, who is the son of Noah. If you remember, Ham was the one who encountered Noah when he was drunk, did some sort of sin that involved Noah in some way. We're not given a lot of description about what that was. And so the descendants of Ham and Canaan were cursed because of it. They settled in this region. And so we describe these people as the people of Canaan. These are the Canaanite nations. Okay, they weren't all Canaanite nations in this region, but the bulk of these nations that they're going to expel were. So the nations that were not were the Phoenicians, which are here in the far north of the land. They lived in this little stretch here north of Mount Carmel along this coastal plain. They were primarily sea traders. They had excellent harbors here at Tyre and Sidon here in the far north. We talked about, if you recall, there are no natural harbors along the main stretch of the coast of Canaan. It wasn't until you got north of Mount Carmel where you had a couple of really good spots for that. They lived in this region, and they controlled this plain for much of the Old Testament. Then you have the Philistine nation, which is down here in the south. These were also not from the descendants of Cain, but they certainly lived in this area. They were a particularly strong nation. We believe that they came from the sea. They came in through a different part of the world, somewhere else along the Mediterranean, and settled along in this area. These were the sea peoples. We see this nation caused a lot of difficulty for Israel as they went forward. If you'll think about some of the key antagonists of Israel throughout the days of Saul and David, it was the Philistines here. And so they really were a thorn in their side. And then you have the rest of the land of Canaan and the Canaanite nations. On the western side, you had these two nations, two kings rather. They were both of the Amorite nation. The Amorites were really the strongest, largest nation of the Canaanites themselves. Sometimes you'll see in the Bible the word Amorite is used to describe specifically this group of Canaan, and sometimes you'll see it to describe the Canaanites as a whole. Okay? In the same way that we use tissue, or Kleenex rather, to describe all kinds of different tissues, sometimes it will use Amorites to describe all these kinds of nations, regardless of exactly which descendant of Canaan they were actually from. So you'll see that in several different places. Okay, the bulk of the Amorites Amorites proper were on the eastern shore, but there were pockets of them all throughout the rest of the land as well. We also have the Hittites. These were mainly came from Asia Minor, but there were, again, pockets of them throughout this land. And you'll see several different spots on this map specifically that highlights the Hittites. They were frequently in trade with the other nations. If you remember, Abraham bought a cave from a Hittite in Genesis 23 to bury his family in. So they were in the nation as far back as then. We also have a bunch of smaller, less powerful tribes. These were the Hivites, the Girgashites, the Perizzites, and the Jebusites. They were small and spread out throughout the entire land. And you'll see them kind of listed in different places on this map. This map does a really good job of kind of making it appear that they're centralized to a general area. It's not quite really the way it was. They were kind of spread out all over a little bit. The Gibeonites, which factor into Joshua 9, they deceived the people of Israel, were of the Hivite nation. But again, you will see them described as Amorites later on in 1 Samuel, because again, sometimes Amorite is used as a whole. In addition to that, we see that factors into the fears of the spies that came down in Numbers 13, the giants of the land. They were there in the days of Abraham. They're mentioned in Genesis 14. We don't know exactly where they came from or how they came to be or why they were so large. Genetics, right? So we don't really know where they came down and factored into that, but they are called the sons of Anak in Numbers 13 and Joshua 14. And we know that they were mainly central in this area. Hebron seems to have had a lot of them. We see that later in Joshua. And then they were pushed out into the land of the Philistines, which is where we get Goliath coming from. He was a descendant of Anak, of the Anakim. And if you remember, Moses assured the people that God would allow them to push them out regardless of how strong they were, how numerous they were, how large they were, how powerful they were. The Canaanite religion was polytheistic. Okay, the main key god, the most popular one that they worshipped, was Baal, which is this image here. He was the king of the Canaanite gods, but he had a father, interesting enough. His name was El, which we know to be a name of God that's used often in the Bible. If you think Bethlehem and some of the other Israelite words, that El is in there, so signifying Yahweh. Baal is the god of the storms. Baal was a real issue for the people. He factors into a lot of the period of the judges, the periods of the kings and the prophets, particularly when we talk about the division between the two kingdoms and the northern kingdom of Israel. Baal pops up a lot. You'll see throughout Judges, Baal is used. The Israelites use their names and fashion them after Baal a lot of the times. Gideon, for example, in in Judges 6, was Jerubbaal or Jerubbaal. That was his other name. This was a problem for these people. Baal was a problem for these people. This is Anath. This was the sister spouse of Baal. She was the goddess of fertility and war. She's depicted in literature a number of times for her ferociousness, her cruelty. She's mentioned in Judges 3 and Judges 5. The judge Shamgar is described as the son of Anath, leading some to believe that he wasn't actually an Israelite, but rather he could have been of a Canaanite nation that God used to judge the people here at this time. The worship that occurred in this was taking place in these high places. This is an image of Gezer. It factors into Joshua 10, Joshua 16. This image dates back, we believe, to about 1500 BC. It makes up of 10 large stones, and you see these kind of standing all along in this ring of stones here. There were priests that were involved in this. The stones represent male deities, so Baal or El or any number of other gods they had. If they had a female goddess they were worshiping, they would use wooden poles or trees or something along those lines to differentiate between male and female. And so you'll see, for example, Asherah is listed a number of times in different places in the Bible. This was a goddess that was widely worshipped in this area. The pictures were obscene, so I didn't put any in the slideshow for tonight. But it played a prominent role in that she was symbolized by wooden poles. And so the Israelites were warned against worshiping the Ashtoreths. Okay, these were globally just goddesses represented by these wooden poles. Worship was emphasized fertility rites. Prostitution of both men and women were commonplace in Canaanite worship, both heterosexually and homosexually. And you would see that depending on where you worshipped, certain guilds would pop up of these prostitutes so that you could go and you knew exactly what type of guild or what you were going to get when you went to a specific site to worship. It was believed that engagement in these excesses would cause prosperity and harvest and procreation and livestock breeding and anything else you could imagine. They wanted them worshiping, and they did, with everything they had and every kind of sin you could possibly imagine. We see in the Bible listed human sacrifice, like we said, prostitution, all kinds of different things that came up. Other acts involved singing, dancing, divination and sorcery, snake worship, bestiality, human sacrifice. Pagan worship was horrific, and it was sinful, and it was pure wickedness in the sight of God. If you want to talk about one reason that these nations were being judged by God here, bringing the Israelites to wipe them out, this is a key driver. It was evil in the sight of God. We also have here on this map the Moabite nation and Edom and Ammon. These were not Canaanite nations. We know these were descended in the case of the Moabites and the Ammonites from Lot. Edom came from Esau. These were relatives of the Israelites. And so God forbade them from destroying the nations as they went about seeking the land for themselves. These were all descended from Terah, who was a descendant of Shem rather than Ham. Okay? Let's go ahead and pick it up in verse 12 of chapter 1. And to the Reubenites, the Gadites, and half the tribe of Manasseh, Joshua spoke, saying, Remember the word which Moses, the servant of the Lord, commanded you, saying, The Lord your God is giving you rest, and is giving you this land. Your wives, your little ones, and your livestock shall remain in the land which Moses gave you on this side of the Jordan. But you shall pass before your brethren armed, all your mighty men of valor, and help them, until the Lord has given your brethren rest, as he gave you. And they also have taken possession of the land which the Lord is giving them. Then you shall return to the land of your possession and enjoy it, which Moses, the Lord's servant, gave you on this side of the Jordan, towards the sunrise. So they answered Joshua, saying, All that you command us we will do, and wherever you send us we will go. Just as we heeded Moses in all things, so we will heed you. Only the Lord your God be with you, as he was with Moses. Whoever rebels against your command and does not heed your word, and all that you command him shall be put to death. Only be strong and of good courage. If you'll recall, in Numbers 32, they encounter the Amorite nation here on the east side of the Jordan. That's Sihon and Og. Moses leads the people here. They capture this land, and it was very good. If you remember that the tribes Reuben and Gad and half of Manasseh, they were livestockmen, and so they saw that the land was good for pasture land, and they wanted it, so they asked for it, and Moses gave it to them on the condition that they didn't stay there and consider their job done, but rather they settled, they got their family started, and then when everybody crossed over, the men of war would go with them to help their brethren finish the job on the other side of the Jordan, and then they could go back home. So Reuben settles in the far south of it, in the territory that was formerly Sihon. Gad was just north of that, and then the half of Manasseh took the region of Og up here. This region here, you'll see this natural grasslands was really good for livestock. We talked about how this was on the Transjordan Plateau, where it came up out of the Jordan Valley and then was a nice long plateau until you got to the Arabian Desert. It was perfect for what they were looking for and what they needed. And so they asked for it. And so they got it on the condition that they would go help their brethren. Okay, so that brings us to tonight's lesson. So we're going to look at they're preparing and they're entering the land, this military prep that they're doing to get into the land. That wasn't all that was required. Next week, we're going to talk about the spiritual preparation they also had to do to be ready to take what God was going to give them. But they had to get there first. So we're going to start reading in Joshua 2, and we're going to read the entirety of Joshua 2 here, and then we're going to study some things from it. Joshua 2. Now Joshua the son of Nun sent out 2 men from Acacia Grove to spy secretly, saying, "Go view the land, especially Jericho." So they went and came to the house of a harlot named Rahab and lodged there. And it was told the king of Jericho, saying, "Behold, men have come here tonight from the children of Israel to search out the country." So the king of Jericho sent to Rahab, saying, "Bring out the men who have come to you, who have entered your house, for they have come to search out all the country." Then the woman took the 2 men and hid them. So she said, "Yes, the men came to me, and I did not know where they were from. And it happened as the gate was being shut, when it was dark, that the men went out. Where the men went, I do not know. Pursue them quickly, for they may overtake them." But she had brought them up to the roof and hidden them with the stacks of flax, which she had laid in order on the roof. Then the men pursued them on the road to the Jordan, to the fords. And as soon as those who pursued them had gone out, they shut the gate. Now before they lay down, she came up to them on the roof and said to the men, "I know that the Lord has given you the land, that the terror of you has fallen on us, and that all the inhabitants of the land are faint-hearted because of you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the 2 kings of the Amorites who were on this other side of the Jordan, Sihon and Og, whom you utterly destroyed. And as soon as we heard these things, our hearts melted. Neither did there remain any more courage in anyone because of you. For the Lord your God, he is God in heaven, above and on earth beneath. Now therefore, I beg you, swear to me by the Lord, since I have shown you kindness, that you also show kindness to my father's house, and give me a token, and spare my father, my mother, my brothers, my sisters, and all that they have, and deliver our lives from death." So the men answered her, "Our lives are for yours, if none of you tell this business of ours. And it shall be, when the Lord has given us the land, that we will deal kindly and truly with you." Then she let them down by a rope through the window, for her house was on the city wall. She dwelt on the wall. And she said to them, "Go to the mountain, lest the pursuers meet you. Hide there 3 days, until the pursuers have returned. Afterward you may go your way." So the men said to her, "We will be blameless of this oath of yours, which you have made us swear, unless, when we come into the land, you bind this line of scarlet cord in the window through which you let us down, and unless you bring your father, your mother, your brothers, and all your father's household to your own home. So it shall be that whoever goes outside the doors of your house into the street, his blood shall be on his own head, and we will be guiltless. And whoever is with you in the house, his blood shall be on our head if a hand is laid on him. And if you tell this business of ours, then we will be free from your oath, which you made us swear." Then she said, "According to the words, so be it." And she sent them away. And they departed, and she bound the scarlet cord in the window. They departed and went to the mountain and stayed there 3 days until the pursuers returned. The pursuers sought them all along the way, but they did not find them. So the 2 men returned, descended from the mountain, crossed over, and they came to Joshua the son of Nun and told him all that had befallen them. And they said to Joshua, Truly the Lord has delivered all the land into our hands. For indeed all the inhabitants of the country are faint-hearted because of us." So at this point, Joshua and the tribe of Israel is encamped right around here at Abel Shittim, which is translated in my Bible, Acacia Grove. Okay, this is on the plains of Moab. This is where they are at the end of Numbers and throughout Deuteronomy. When Moses is giving his last words of encouragement throughout Deuteronomy, and then he goes up onto Mount Nebo, which is just a little bit further south, and he dies. It's not very far. It's about 6 miles from the river, and it's about 13 miles from Jericho on the other side of the river. So the spies leave Joshua at this encampment. While they're gone, we read in chapter 3 that Joshua moves the people. Then Joshua rose early in the morning, and they set out from Acacia Grove and came to the Jordan, he, all, and the children of Israel, and lodged there before they cross over. And so it was 3 days later that they prepped to go over. If you'll remember in chapter 1, he told them in 3 days they would cross over the Jordan in verse 11. So there's some back and forth here in terms of time frame. Joshua is still preparing while these spies are out. He knows they're going to go over the land and take the land itself. So he prepares the people to be ready. So what was the mission of the 2 spies?
They're trying to get intelligence about Jericho to strengthen the heart of people.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So go view this land, especially Jericho. Jericho is the first stop. It is right on the other side of the Jordan. It is the first city they're going to come to when they cross over. And so it's the first place they need to capture. And so Joshua sends the spies. Was that needed from a military standpoint? Was there anything military they gained from that information that was going to help them in the battle? No. So why do it?
The deliverance of Rahab.
Deliverance of Rahab. Okay. And what did you say?
Just to build their faith and trust in the Lord.
Yeah. What happened the last time they were in the land?
They didn't believe.
They didn't believe and they left. Okay. They need to send someone in. This is my interpretation of what's happening. They need to send someone in, come back, bring, yes, we got this, regardless of what they see, to build the faith and encouragement of the people. Chapter 1, we talked over and over, we see this phrase, be strong and of good courage. They're building the courage of the people here. It's necessary. Yes, Rahab plays a very key role in the lineage of Jesus. She needed to be saved. That was another great thing that came from this.
God was always willing to save the faithful. He was willing to spare Sodom and Gomorrah over 10 faithful.
Absolutely. Yeah, and we're going to talk about Rahab and her faith in just a moment. Yes. Anybody have anything else? Any other comments on this? Okay. What kind of person was Rahab?
Well, aside from how she was described, when she was helping the spies, I'd say she was a very intelligent and wise person because she understood what was happening. I mean, she could see the signs, and she knew how to play her cards accordingly to get herself and her family out of the crossfire.
Yeah, so she saw what was coming. Yeah, and she was ready to take advantage of it to help out her own family. She understood what was about to come.
She was a prostitute, and that's clear. And but she was also very concerned for her family. So and she was willing to accept the evidence of what she had heard about the Red Sea.
Yep. So she was a Canaanite, first of all, right? She was not of the tribe of Israel. She was a prostitute. That was brought up. How did she handle the situation when the king came to her and asked for the men? What did she do? She lied. She's a liar. Okay. This describes a sinful person, right? She was a sinful person. She had committed sins in her past. But she was a pagan. We talked about that too. As a Canaanite, she was a pagan person. Whether she participated in this prostitution that was up at the high places, I don't know. We're not told that. I don't think there's enough evidence here to even say that that would be a possibility. It is believed. So prostitution can take lots of different forms. Okay. She had a place where travelers stayed. Okay, so she owned a house on the wall. That does not mean, obviously, that the spies were going there to partake in prostitution, okay, but rather that she had a house where prostitution took place, but not necessarily that was the only thing that was happening here. It was lodging for visitors, people who were coming through Jericho. This was a place that visitors would go to stay and lodge for the night. Thus why the king sent to her and said, hey, bring us the people, okay? If a visitor's there, it seems to be this might be the place that they were, okay? She was also someone who feared God. That's very evident from her response here. She respected him, his power. She knew what he could do. She recognized his true sovereignty. He is God in heaven above and on earth below, verse 11. She recognized that he was God above everything else. The pagan gods she worshiped before, they were nothing compared to what she saw in the power of God, the true God, and someone who loved her family, who wanted to help him out in the moment.
She also believed the miracles that were done at them crossing the Red Sea. It had been 40 years. They're still talking about what God had done that long ago, and she didn't discount it. I mean, she still believed that that was by the power of God, the true God.
Well, you know what I find interesting about these statements here is that, as you said, it was 40 years ago. So she mentioned something that happened 40 years ago and something that happened 2 months ago, or whatever the time frame is, in the last year, right? Somehow they knew that this was the same nation that crossed the Red Sea. They were slaves in Egypt. They crossed the Red Sea out of Egypt, and then they also defeated the Amorites. Somehow this message of all the things that have been happening have been transmitted to her, and she believed. She knew and she believed. Okay? We're going to talk more about her faith in a moment. Matthew?
So you mentioned someone who feared God. She wasn't the only person who feared God there.
Correct.
As she describes it, everybody's afraid of God there. But she's the one who decided to do something about it rather than trying to oppose God as the king is doing.
Yeah, you leapfrog me here, so let's go to the question about that, which is totally fine. No problem at all. The Canaanites, this is, I think, question 3, I think. The Canaanite, their reaction, what were the reactions they had to the stories? It was terror. She describes faint-heartedness, no more courage lasting. Their hearts melted. Did they believe the stories? Yes. But did they have the same reaction to the stories that Rahab had? No. What's the difference? They both had faith in the stories, right?
I think the best way to describe it, adding on to my earlier point, is that Rahab, as a key difference, she chose the smart path of riding this particular river's current rather than trying to fight against it and inevitably be swept away by it. She understood that this wasn't a fight that they could win, and like I said earlier, got herself and her family out of the crossfire when they had a chance.
Well, I agree. I think the other Canaanites, the people of Jericho, also felt that was a battle they could not win. They were terrified. There was no courage left in them. Angela?
One had a true fear of God, and the other ones did not.
Right. There's a difference between believing and obedient faith. One believes but doesn't do anything with that. The other believes, understands, and seeks the grace of God. And there's the difference. Rahab here sought salvation through the God who was going to win. And she did it. Did she understand what that meant? Probably not. But she knew that that was where being saved lay for her and her family. And so God was willing to allow for that, right? She sought God's mercy and grace and salvation. And she was willing to do the things that it took, and we're going to talk about what those steps were in a moment, that it took in order to be saved from death. Yeah. And so, yes, Miles.
I feel like that's also, in a sense, the two reactions you see to Jesus. Not to, I don't know if that's taking that too far, but I feel like those are kind of the two reactions people have to God in general. Like the Pharisees hear his parables, know that the parables are directed at them, and want to kill him. And then there's, all types of people who submit to his power because, where else would we go?
Yeah, that's the story of humankind, just across the board, right? All of us are sinners in some form or fashion. Some of us believe also in God, and so we are willing to seek his salvation. Others don't, right? Even when the truth is presented to them. Some will respond favorably and obey and receive their salvation. Some will not, okay? It's all about fear. and respect and what you're going to do with that. Yeah. Any other comments or thoughts? These are all great ones. Matthew.
She's also willing to give things up. She recognizes her life is going to be completely changed. Her city's going to be gone. Pretty much everybody she knows is going to be killed. So she's not going to be able to keep her same livelihood anymore. And she is willing to accept that for the sake of saving her life and families.
Yes. She's willing to sacrifice everything for their salvation here. And you'll see in chapter 6, when they are saved, verse 23, and the young men who had been spies went in and brought out Rahab, her father, her mother, her brothers, and all that they had. So they brought out all her relatives and left them outside the camp of Israel. At this point, she has not been allowed to be joined to the nation of Israel. We do know that comes, right? She converts, for lack of a better term. She's a proselyte. And that comes with time, right? We see she comes an integral part into the lineage of Christ because of what she does, because of who she becomes. That's not yet revealed here, how that's going to play out, but it's key.
I always thought that Rahab also must have had some sort of influence where she was seen as someone who would tell the truth, because her family stayed in the house. And I think about Lot, he couldn't convince his son-in-laws to leave. It's like, man, they just wouldn't give it up. But these people stayed. I don't know how that happened, but it just seems like she had some kind of persuasiveness or something that she convinced them to stay in that when all this was going on.
And it was not immediate when that city fell, right? They marched for 7 days, then they did all this other stuff after crossing before they went over there. It was a month or more before that city actually fell, that she has to keep her family. We need to be ready. We need to be ready. And we see here in verse 21, she said, according to your word, so be it. She sent them away and departed, and she bound that scarlet cord in the window. She didn't waste any time. She's ready for whenever that time comes. She doesn't know the timetable of when the city's going to fall, when the people are going to surround it and take it. But she's going to be ready for whenever that is. She's not leaving anything up to chance here. So how do we reconcile Rahab of Joshua 2, the pagan, the prostitute, the liar, with Hebrews and James? And I put the passages here on the board. Hebrews 11:31, by faith the harlot Rahab did not perish with those who did not believe when she had received the spies with peace. James 2:25, likewise was not Rahab the harlot also justified by works when she received the messengers and sent them out another way? This is a question that always comes up, so I think we need to talk about it and be ready to answer it whenever we do encounter it. How do we reconcile these two pictures, if they are two pictures?
I mean, the way I see it, it's still talking about the same person. Rahab was a harlot. She accepted the spies in her household, hid them away at the risk of her own life and perhaps the lives of everyone else who was under that roof, and sent them on their way, and like you said, wasted no time following the spies' instructions to ensure her own and her family's safety when the rest of the wall was crumbled to dust.
Yep.
I don't see her any different than anyone else that accepts God on his terms. You can have a whole list of people from the Bible, beginning with Abraham, Sarah, David, Peter, Paul. No different.
Right. Yeah. Hebrews 11. It's a men of faith, a passage of faith. Every single one of those people has dark spots and sin in their life. But they're not justified by their sins, right? They're justified by their faith and obedience in God. Okay? God is one who removes those sins by our obedience. Absolutely.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing about Hebrews 11. Just go down and you can see all the people and all the things that they did. There's also progressions being made in a person's life. So sometimes we can look at maybe that one time, not one time, but that period of time when she's the harlot. But there's a change. There's a progression that slowly is going to be made, and that's often the case for us as well. So I think that's another way to consider it.
Yeah, and we talked about that with Rahab. She was clearly a prostitute and all the other things. Then she was outside the camp, and then she was proselytized inside the camp.
I like to use her as a use case for another question that comes up as the cruelty of God in the Old Testament. What all happened to those people? And it was like, if everyone, she did horrible things, right? Who hasn't, right? But she was willing to change. If everyone in Jericho, or everyone in Canaan, everyone anywhere was willing to change, they were going to be spared. And you see that evident by her and like Nineveh. And that's when you say, God wasn't the unreasonable person in this scenario. It was them. They were doing horrible things and weren't ever going to change. But she did. And she got spared. So I like to turn that question around and point out other things that have answered another question of God that's similar. So.
Yep. God's always willing to come to those who come to him.
You know, in these two passages, I've heard this before, people, confused by it. She's never praised for lying or for her harlotry. She's praised, her works are praised by her belief in what she did with the spies. So sometimes when the Bible tells us an account about someone, it can be one of God's faithful people that sinned, right? And it's not that action when Abraham lied is being praised. It's just giving an account of the whole event that's happening. So we have to be careful not to justify all her works into what these two passages are saying.
Absolutely. If you look at anybody's hit story, they have sins in their lives. Everybody. Doesn't matter who they are. What results in justification is our faith and obedience to God. Yeah. The sins shouldn't define them. And it doesn't define Rahab here. Rahab is here being defined by her faith and her obedience to God. Yes, she did other things, but that was not her defining moments. Yeah. Yes. Yes.
1 Corinthians 6 has a whole list of conditions that these Corinthian Christians had been involved in, and such were some of you. So we all have a past.
But you were justified, you were sanctified, you were washed. That was the key thing.
Here. But her active faith, as has been said before, is what put her in this new situation. And she lived in Israel the rest of her life.
She did. She did. Okay, Miles, last comment on this.
She also makes me think of the men in Acts 2 and also the Philippian jailer saying, brothers, what should we do? Or what must I do to be saved? Because it's almost like she sees, again, like other people have mentioned and like you've mentioned, she sees what God is doing or what God's about to do. And she knows, it's almost like she knows she's going to be on the wrong side of history. So she's trying to figure out how to make that switch.
She knows the storm's coming, right? She doesn't know anything about the law of Moses, but she knows it's coming and she knows she needs to be on the right side.
What's the chance of one more time?
It depends on what it is.
In the genealogy, she just mentioned as Rahab. I think that's interesting too, where you see this change, where it's just Rahab, not Rahab the harlot.
Right, right. She became who she was supposed to be. Yeah. Okay. We already talked about the reaction of the Canaanites here. What conditions had to be met for Rahab's salvation? What did she have to do?
They told her.
The ones she told her. What were those things? Hang the cord. Keep the family inside and stay in the house. And don't tell anybody. Yep. Interesting. It's the same cord that they let the guys out with, right? The spies would recognize that cord as what it was. It wouldn't be just anything else hanging out of a window. It would be the cord that they were saved by from the king of Jericho. And then they were going to recognize that. They went to look for it. They brought her out of the city. Okay.
I wasn't being facetious when I said what they told her to do, because so often people are given very specific instructions. And you have to follow these specific instructions you're given.
Yeah. If she had hung any other cord, would it have done anything? No. If she had decided to walk outside to grab the plants off the front porch, would that have made a difference? No. No. They had to follow the directions, regardless of what they were. And Rahab was willing to do it. Okay? We're going to see this over and over. There's going to be very clear directions God gives his people. They have to do it. If they don't do it, plans are going to go awry. Right? It doesn't matter whether you think it's a good plan or a bad plan or a crazy plan or any of these other things. Okay? God has his ways that are higher than our ways. We have to trust in him. Rahab trusted in the men and the God that they represented to save her. She did what it took. And she did it immediately. She didn't waste any time.
The CIA in 1996 released a document about Hushai, who was the first agent of influence. But they also talked about the story of Rahab and how she was, how she helped these spies. And she was a safe housekeeper.
Yeah.
So it's just a fascinating historical story that's not just, people read this and say, okay, yeah, it's a pretty amazing story with how they're going to deliver her and the entire family that the CIA was.
Yeah. She's a key character. She's not given a lot of depth, and we're not told a lot about her, but she's extremely important. Okay, next week, we're going to pick it up here in chapter 3. We're going to go 3 and 4 pretty quickly. We're not going to read all of it, and then we're going to finish up with chapter 5 next week, and then we'll be ready to start.